Hey guys, welcome to The Last Climb. And today I'll go over what an insufferable couple did to their Sherpa on the deadliest mountain on Earth. They treated every warning, every act of guidance as a personal insult until their paranoia pushed their Sherpa off a ledge. Now what they did to that man came back to them, step by frozen step. It was October 9th, 2013. The wind on the Lhotse face was already screaming before the sun came up. And that's where this story really starts. I want to take you up there, detail by detail, because almost everything that happened on this mountain could have been avoided. You know, like most stories that end in tragedy. The climbers were a married couple, Owen and Leora Poissy. Their guide, and the only witness to nearly everything that happened above base camp, was a Sherpa named Akar. Now, as some of you might know, most people who dream about climbing Mount Everest picture the spring season. Late April through May is when the jet stream usually lifts high enough off the summit to create a narrow window of climbable weather, and that's when almost every expedition in history has gone up. Hundreds of climbers, dozens of guide companies, miles of fixed rope already strung up the route by the time any one team gets there. Owen and Leora didn't want that. They were wealthy, experienced trekkers who had done a handful of lower altitude peaks in South America and Europe, and they had convinced themselves that the regular Everest crowd was beneath them. They wanted the autumn season instead, which runs from September through early November. Far fewer climbers attempt it because the weather window is shorter, less predictable, and the cold sets in earlier. Now you have to understand that the most professional guiding outfits will tell you this isn't a lesser route. It's actually a harder one because there are fewer teams to help break trail, fewer fixed lines already in place, and less rescue infrastructure sitting around in case something goes wrong. But to Owen and Leora, autumn wasn't about difficulty. It was about exclusivity. According to people who were on the mountain that season, the couple told several other climbers, practically bragging, that they were tired of waiting behind tourists and wanted a mountain that catered to serious people like themselves. For me, they seemed to genuinely believe that climbing in a quieter season made them more impressive than climbers who had submitted in the spring. Even though spring summits are statistically far more common because the conditions are safer, not because the climbers are weaker, note that it was the first sign of a pattern that would define the entire expedition, mistaking risk for status. Everest Base Camp sits at roughly 17,600 feet above sea level, on a slowly shifting glacier called the Khumbu Glacier. It's not a place where you settle in comfortably. The air holds about half the oxygen it does at sea level, and even simple tasks like tying your boots can leave you out of breath. Most climbers spend 1 to 2 weeks here just letting their bodies adjust before pushing higher. Akar had been guiding on Everest for over a decade by the time he was hired for this expedition. He had submitted multiple times, he spoke fluent English, and based on what I've read on his guiding company logs, he had an excellent safety record. He was the kind of Sherpa that more experienced expedition companies specifically request because he was cautious, by the book, and unflappable. He would need every bit of that patience for what was coming. Almost immediately, the couple started treating him less like a professional guide and more like a built-in excuse machine. On their very first full day at base camp, both Owen and Leora developed headaches, which is an extremely normal symptom of altitude adjustment and happens to nearly everyone who arrives at that elevation without already being acclimatized. Instead of accepting this as a normal part of the climb, they accused Akar of deliberately misreading their pulse oximeter readings, the little device clipped onto a fingertip that measures blood oxygen levels, claiming he wanted to make them look weaker than they actually were. I have to clarify that there is no plausible reason a guide would falsify those numbers. If anything, an inflated reading would be more dangerous for the client, not less. But the accusations set the tone for what was coming. A day later, both of them developed muscle cramps while crossing a short technical section near the edge of the icefall. Cramping at altitude is almost always a sign of dehydration or an electrolyte imbalance, something incredibly common when climbers aren't drinking enough water in the dry, thin mountain air. Rather than acknowledging they likely hadn't been drinking enough, they accused Akar of sabotaging their water bottles, claiming he had filled them with too much electrolyte powder specifically to slow them down. I wasn't there, but reading this part already made me feel so exhausted, and we're a long way to the end of this story. By their second day at base camp, their behavior had started to affect people outside their own team. With only a handful of other expeditions on the mountain that season, they interrupted a conversation with one of the few neighboring teams just to boast about how much they had paid for their permits, and at one point loudly speculated, within earshot of that same small group, that the team was probably underqualified because their gear looked older and more worn. The climber closest to them overheard the comment directly, and Akar had to personally apologize on the couple's behalf to smooth things over. It wasn't his comment, but it was already becoming his job to clean up after them. Base camp is a temporary city on moving ice, governed by unspoken social rules where reputation matters. Guides like Akar rely on informal sharing of safety info. Clients who insult neighboring teams constrain those relationships, making the expedition harder for everyone, including their own support staff. The Khumbu Icefall is widely considered one of the most dangerous sections of the entire Everest route, not because it's especially high, but because it's constantly moving. It's a frozen river of ice, riddled with crevasses that can be over 100 feet deep, and the ice shifts and cracks open new gaps without warning. Climbers cross it using aluminum ladders, lashed together over the widest gaps, and the entire section is rigged with fixed ropes for safety. Guides drill one thing into climbers before they ever step onto the icefall: maintain spacing. If too many people are clustered on the same ladder or rope section, and the ice shifts, everyone on that section is in danger together. It's one of the most basic, non-negotiable safety rules on the mountain, and to no one's surprise, Owen ignored it almost immediately. He pushed ahead of the spacing interval multiple times, later telling Akar that those kinds of procedures were for amateurs. At one crevasse crossing, his impatience caused a brief backup, with the only other rope team on the route that morning waiting behind him while he fumbled with his harness on the ladder. Rather than take responsibility for slowing things down, he blamed Akar afterward, claiming the guide had embarrassed him in front of the other climbers by not preparing him properly. It's worth pausing here so that I can point out what guides actually do during a crossing like that. Akar's job was to check Owen's harness, make sure his crampons were secured, and walk him through the ladder crossing technique, which most first-time Everest climbers genuinely do need help with. None of that is embarrassing. It's standard. But to Owen, needing help at all seemed to register as a personal insult, and somehow that insult always ended up redirected at Akar. The icefall crossing usually takes between 2 and 4 hours, depending on conditions, and ladders sometimes have to be crossed sideways, with crampon spikes balanced on narrow aluminum rungs over open crevasses below. Most climbers describe their first crossing as one of the more nerve-wracking parts of the entire expedition, simply because it requires trusting equipment and ropes in a way that feels deeply unnatural. Akar had crossed that same icefall more times than he could easily count over his career, and he understood, probably better than almost anyone else on the mountain that season, how quickly overconfidence could turn into a real emergency. He kept urging the couple to slow down and follow the spacing rules, not because he wanted to control them, but because the alternative put every climber behind them at risk too. Above the icefall sits Camp 1 at around 19,500 feet, the first real rest stop on the upper mountain. Climbers typically do several rotations between base camp and the higher camps before attempting the summit, partly to acclimatize and partly to stock the camps with supplies. At Camp 1, fuel is one of the most carefully rationed resources on the mountain. Stoves run on canisters that have to be carried up by hand, and melting snow into drinking or washing water eats through fuel fast at altitude, since water takes longer to boil with less oxygen available for combustion. Guides have to ration fuel carefully across the entire expedition, because running out high on the mountain can be a life-threatening problem, not just an inconvenience. Owen and Leora demanded extra water specifically for washing, not drinking, despite Akar explaining the fuel limitations clearly. When he told them he couldn't spare the extra fuel, they accused him of withholding supplies because, in their words, he enjoyed watching clients suffer. Imagine being the one responsible for every ounce of fuel, every ration counted down to the last safe margin, while 2 clients look at you like restraint is cruelty. In a car's position, you wouldn't just be arguing about water, you'd be calculating whether their comfort today costs everyone's survival tomorrow. Crossing the western CWM, a relatively flat glacial valley between Camp 1 and Camp 2, also sometimes nicknamed the Valley of Silence, because the surrounding walls block wind and trap heat, the couple repeatedly wandered off the marked safety track. Their reason wasn't safety or curiosity. They wanted clean photographs without other climbers visible in the background. Each time, a car redirected them back toward the established route, since wandering off track in a glaciated valley can mean stepping near hidden crevasses covered by thin snow bridges. Each time, they complained that he was ruining their expedition memories. Despite the Valley of Silence's heat and sunburn risk, Akar reminded the couple to adjust layers. They ignored him, focusing on photos instead, and reached Camp 2 drenched in sweat, which would become dangerous once temperatures plummeted after sunset. The rotation up to Camp 2, sitting close to 21,300 feet, requires climbers to use a piece of equipment called a jumar, a mechanical device that grips a fixed rope and slides upward but locks in place if you fall, allowing climbers to safely ascend steep or icy terrain. It takes practice to use efficiently. Climbers who haven't trained with one tend to move jerkily, wasting enormous amounts of energy. As I've mentioned before, the couple is an experienced trekker. However, neither Owen nor Leora had practiced enough with their jumars before the trip, and it showed. Their technique was clumsy, and the inefficient up and down motion exhausted them far more than necessary. Instead of acknowledging the obvious lack of practice, they told Akar he had set an impossibly fast pace, specifically to humiliate them. Then, when Akar slowed his own pace to stay closer to them, they flipped the accusation entirely and accused him of intentionally dragging out the climb so he could bill extra overtime hours. There was no winning. Too fast meant cruelty. Too slow meant greed. Near Camp 2, Akar urged the couple to move quickly beneath ice cliffs prone to calving. Still frustrated, Owen and Leora ignored him and stopped twice to rest in the hazardous zone. No ice fell that day, but debris had come down there just a day earlier, confirming Akar's urgency was warranted. At Camp 3, perched on the exposed Lhotse face at roughly 23,500 feet, one of them discovered a small leak near the zipper of their expedition down suit. The bulky insulated outerwear designed to protect against temperatures that regularly drop far below zero at that altitude. This wasn't new damage. It was, by all evidence gathered afterward, a manufacturing defect that had likely existed since they bought the suit, something they apparently noticed but ignored back in Kathmandu before the trip even began. Rather than accept this as bad luck or an oversight on their own part, they spun an elaborate theory that Akar had secretly swapped their suit with a damaged rental unit, keeping the higher quality suit for himself, out of resentment toward their wealth. I think it's an important detail because it shows how deep their paranoia had become by this point. They weren't just blaming him for accidents and inconveniences anymore. They were now constructing entire imagined betrayals, complete with motive, despite having no evidence whatsoever. At Camp 3, severe cold makes a functional downsuit critical. When their zipper failed, a car offered to repair it, but the couple, suspecting him of sabotage, refused. Their duct tape fix only partially worked, leaving a persistent draft for the rest of the climb. That same evening, after a supply delay caused by storm weather lower on the mountain, dinner arrived lukewarm. They berated the cook staffing the thinly staffed camp who served it, demanded a replacement meal, and afterward complained loudly to Akar that everyone on the mountain seemed incompetent except themselves. I would have lost my patience if I was there. Above roughly 26,000 feet, climbers enter what's commonly called the death zone, the elevation at which the human body can no longer acclimatize no matter how much time it spends there, because there simply isn't enough oxygen in the air to sustain normal bodily function for long. This is why almost every climber above that elevation uses supplemental bottled oxygen, delivered through a mask connected to a regulator that controls the flow rate. Managing that flow rate correctly is one of the most important skills on the mountain. Set it too low, and a climber can become dangerously hypoxic. set it too high, and the limited supply of oxygen in each tank burns through far faster than it's supposed to, leaving a climber without enough gas during the most demanding, highest, most dangerous part of the entire route. On the Lhotse face, Owen and Leora's oxygen consumption spiked dramatically. Investigators later determined the likely cause was that the couple had been cranking their regulator valves to maximum flow since Camp 2 days earlier than necessary. Now, I've featured a lot of climbing stories in this channel, and it's a classic mistake made by climbers who panic at the first sign of breathlessness. What you should do instead is trust a properly calibrated lower flow rate. It's a mistake guides specifically train clients to avoid, because it can leave a climber without enough oxygen exactly when they need it most, near the summit, far from any chance of resupply. But this couple doesn't listen. And get this, instead of recognizing their own panicked overuse, they insisted Akar had deliberately calibrated the regulators too low from the very start out of spite. Can you imagine that? A standard Everest oxygen cylinder, depending on the size and the flow rate selected, typically lasts somewhere between 5 and 8 hours of continuous use. Climbers are supposed to budget that supply across an entire summit push, which on the standard route can take anywhere from 10 to 18 hours round trip from Camp 4. Guides like Akar spend a significant amount of their training learning how to monitor a client's flow rate and gauge readings throughout a climb, partly because exhausted, hypoxic climbers are notoriously bad at noticing their own usage, and partly because a single mistake with the valve setting made hours earlier and miles lower on the mountain can turn into a life-threatening shortage exactly when a climber is at their highest and most exposed. By the time Owen and Leora reached Camp 4, their cylinders were already showing usage levels closer to what a single summit attempt should consume on its own, not what should have remained after only a portion of the climb. Around this same point in the climb, during a rest stop, Leora deliberately unclipped a piece of trash, an empty energy gel wrapper, from her pack, and let the wind carry it down the slope. Leave no trace principles are taken extremely seriously on Everest, partly out of basic environmental respect, and partly because the mountain has dealt with a real garbage problem from decades of expeditions. When Akar retrieved the wrapper himself and reminded her of the expedition's waste rules, she laughed it off, telling him someone else would probably pick it up eventually. Every night on the upper mountain, the couple found something new to blame on Akar. They blamed him for the cold in their tents, accusing him of pitching the tents at the wrong angle and causing their frostbitten toes. They accused him of hoarding the warmer chemical hand warmer packets for his own sleeping bag, despite there being no evidence of this. Every cough, every labored breathing fit, every dizzy spell at altitude, all of it became something he had supposedly caused. He was blamed for choosing a hiking line that made them dizzy. He was blamed for starving them by rationing personal snacks that, in reality, they themselves had overeaten earlier in the trip. At one point, they even blamed him for the timing of the jet stream's seasonal shift, the very same upper atmospheric wind pattern that determines when a summit window opens at all, as though he had personally scheduled the winds specifically to thwart their plans. I have to say, Akar's patience is very impressive. I would have flipped out multiple times in the story, screamed, ripped their heads off. You have no idea. At Camp 4, the final camp before the summit push, sitting at around 26,300 feet on the South Col, they complained incessantly that the route felt abandoned because of how few other climbers were visible. They argued that someone should have warned them that autumn expeditions came with reduced support personnel and fewer climbers on the mountain. Have you noticed that the irony seemed completely lost on them? I mean, avoiding crowds had been the entire reason they chose the autumn season in the first place, wasn't it? They had wanted exclusivity, and now, faced with the isolation that exclusivity actually requires, they treated it as another failure to blame on someone else. What more do they want? The South Col is a harsh, exposed plateau between Everest and Lhotse with strong winds and no shelter, where climbers are urged to rest and conserve energy before summit attempts. Akar tried to get the couple to eat and hydrate properly, but they remained distracted and barely consumed enough, leaving them underfueled as night fell before the climb. The summit push began in the dark, somewhere around 9 or 10 at night, which is standard practice on Everest. Climbers typically leave Camp 4 at night specifically so they can reach the summit around sunrise and have enough daylight remaining to descend safely before afternoon weather and exhaustion become deadly factors. According to investigators, who pieced together the timeline afterward, using radio logs, satellite tracker data, and a car's own account, the climb that night was tense and largely silent, heavy with the accumulated resentment of the previous 2 weeks. The cold, that high on the mountain, often well below negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill, causes a specific mechanical problem with oxygen systems. Moisture in a climber's breath, combined with the extreme temperature difference, can cause ice to form inside the valve and regulator components of an oxygen tank after days of continuous heavy use. It's a known issue, and experienced guides routinely check and clear their own equipment of this ice buildup as a simple maintenance step. At one point on a narrow snow ledge during the ascent, Akar paused to perform exactly this kind of maintenance check, tapping his own regulator to clear ice that had built up around the valve. It was something he had done countless times across his career, a completely routine, almost automatic motion. The section of the route where this happened sits above the balcony, a small resting platform around 27,600 feet, in a stretch sometimes called the most exposed and committing part of the entire climb. The path narrows considerably here, hugging a ridge with steep drops on both sides, and climbers are required to stay clipped into the fixed rope at all times. I can't believe I even have to say this. It is not a place where people normally stop to argue. Conversation at that altitude is difficult enough just to manage breathing and footing, let alone raise a voice loud enough to be heard over the wind, which makes what happened next even more jarring when investigators later tried to piece it together. But Owen and Leora, exhausted, hypoxic despite their oxygen masks, and already saturated with 2 weeks of paranoid resentment, saw something different. They saw Akar calm, his posture relaxed, and they noticed his oxygen gauge appeared full. In their exhausted, oxygen-deprived state, this scene became to them undeniable proof of theft. They concluded, with no evidence beyond their own fear and exhaustion, that he had secretly swapped oxygen cylinders during the night, or had deliberately given them partially used bottles from the start while saving the fullest tanks for himself. What followed, based on the only first-hand account available, was a sudden and venomous accusation screamed into the wind on that narrow ledge. They accused him of stockpiling the group's oxygen supply, of deliberately letting them suffocate on the mountain so that he could somehow claim the summit glory for himself. It's important to be honest about what we don't know here. There were no other witnesses on that specific stretch of the route at that specific moment. Investigators have had to reconstruct what happened next using physical evidence, the positions of recovered bodies, equipment found at the scene, and Akar's own testimony, which he gave under oath during the official inquiry that followed. Anything describing the couple's internal thoughts, their exact tone, or their precise physical actions beyond what physical evidence supports should be understood as the most plausible reconstruction based on that investigation, not a confirmed, witnessed account. What is known is that the confrontation escalated rapidly on a section of fixed rope along a narrow, exposed ridge, the kind of terrain on Everest where a single misstep can mean a fall of over 1,000 feet. According to Akar's testimony, and the physical evidence recovered afterward, Owen, in his fury, lunged toward Akar's harness, apparently attempting to physically check the oxygen tank himself or seize it outright. In the resulting struggle, on terrain offering no real footing and no margin for error, Akar was pushed off the fixed line. He fell. But his fall was arrested almost immediately by the safety carabiner clipped into the fixed rope, a basic piece of climbing protection that exists for exactly this kind of moment. He was left dangling against the rope and the mountainside, suffering serious trauma from the violent fall and prolonged suspension at extreme altitude, but alive and still clipped in. Owen and Leora were not as fortunate in the moments that followed. Investigators believe that the same struggle which pushed Akar off balance had also destabilized the couple's own positioning on the narrow section of rope, and that in the chaos and exhaustion of the altitude, they lost their own secure footing. Based on the recovered evidence and the path of the fall line discovered afterward, both Owen and Leora fell from the ridge. Unlike Akar, neither of them survived the fall. Akar was eventually able to climb back onto the fixed line, but the fall and the prolonged suspension in the thin, freezing air above the balcony had already done lasting damage. Severely weakened, suffering from frostbite, internal injuries, and a shoulder injury that left him unable to grip the rope properly, he managed only a short distance before losing his hold on the fixed line a second time. This time there was no one nearby to help, and he fell from the upper ridge near the route to the South Col. His radio call describing what had happened on the ledge above the balcony reached Camp 4 only minutes before his fall, and that transmission became the single most detailed account investigators had to work with. His body was recovered weeks later by a separate expedition team during favorable conditions, and the location and condition of his remains were consistent with the fall he had described over the radio, making his testimony one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. The bodies of Owen and Leora were never recovered because the operation carried significant risk for everyone involved, given the elevation and unpredictable weather of that part of the mountain. Akar's body, found at a lower and more accessible point on the ridge, was the only one of the three that searchers were able to bring down. An official inquiry followed, drawing on Akar's detailed testimony, satellite tracking logs from the team's safety devices, and physical evidence gathered from the recovery operation. The investigation concluded that the most plausible explanation for the fall was the confrontation on the ridge, triggered by the couple's mistaken belief that Akar had stolen their oxygen supply, a belief built not on any real evidence but on 2 weeks of accumulated, baseless resentment toward the one person whose entire job had been to keep them alive. I'm no psychologist, but this tragedy was a textbook case of projection. The couple's deep-seated insecurities about their own competence were externalized onto Akar, leading them to interpret his every life-saving action as a personal attack. Look at what they got from that.